1950s, Havana and Varadero Beach were the great playgrounds for the American rich and middle class.
The scenes in Godfather 2 set the stage very, very well. Cuba was wide open. The mafia was there, of course. The casinos were open. But there was also a sense of joie de vivre.
Cuba was a fun place. If you had lots of money and you were an American and you wanted to gamble, you wanted to have a little kinky sex, Cuba was perfect. You wanted to have the nice beach, good service, good food. That was the Cuba that Americans saw. The rest of Cuba wasn't quite like that. Rural Cuba was terribly underdeveloped. There was tremendous illiteracy in the countryside. The small farmer didn't have machines, oftentimes didn't have even animals to work the land. Cane cutting was the largest single occupation in Cuba. It's terrible work. It only lasts for a few months a year. For people who had money or had a profession that you could practice, Cuba was a really good place. But that was not the majority. The Cuban economy was a classical dependent economy. Much of the ownership was not in Cuban hands. Telephone, the utilities, the mines, the best land, the largest sugar mills, foreign trade, and the banking system. All of this was in the hands of U.S. companies.
Cuba's strongman, who appeared with his family at a press reception, seemed untroubled by Castro's mounting offensive.
Beneath that, though, there was a political dictatorship.
Batista seemed upset about reports in the American press of police brutality and corruption.
His government was terribly corrupt. When Batista fell in January of 1959, there was no question as to who was going to dominate the political landscape in Cuba from that point forward.
Fidel Castro's revolution arrived with the promise of widespread social reform. Peasants would get land, health care and education would be free, and everyone would be taught to read, as long as they were loyal to the revolution. Decades of poverty and corruption seemed finally to have come to an end.
Castro had a terribly charismatic personality. If there had been any doubt while he was in the mountains, once he was on that political stage and in front of the TV cameras, there was none at all. January the 9th, when he gave his first nationwide televised speech, they released a flight of white doves as a symbol of peace. And they all flew up into the sky except one, which landed on Castro's shoulder, fluttered up, then came back, and remained on his shoulder during much of the speech. In the Santeria religion, the white dove is the messenger from the gods to indicate the anointed one. Well, the gods had indicated it was Castro. You could hear gasps in the crowd and people falling to their knees. Castro was tremendously popular. I would say that he had the overwhelming support. 90% of the Cuban people, or perhaps more, had full confidence in him and supported him without question.
The cry in Havana is, Cuba, see, Yankees, no. The trucks belong to the American-owned Cuban Electric Company, recently nationalized by the government, along with the telephone company, also American-owned.
Along towards the end of the summer of 1959, Castro decided it was time to begin moving toward the left.
And among the things he did, among the many no-nos, was the expropriation of property. Not only Cuban property, but U.S. property.
His latest blow against the United States, the seizure of $750 million of American-owned properties in Cuba.
There was always a question as to whether he was a communist. The information was ambiguous.
I have said very clear that we are not communists. Very clear.
Eisenhower finally came to the view, reluctantly, that Castro was an adversary and a danger, and that something had to be done about it.
In January 1960, the Soviet Deputy Premier, Anastas Mikoyan, came to Havana. The stage had been set for him.
With the Cold War, the pretext for all intervention now was anti-communism. When the United States ordered its oil refineries, Texaco and Esso at the time, in Cuba, not to refine Soviet oil, Castro nationalized the refineries. Castro got Soviet oil because he couldn't get any other oil. So the die had been cast.
Fidel Castro was determined to chart an independent course for Cuba, independent of the influence of the United States. And the United States in the 1950s and early 1960s was simply not prepared to accept that sort of outcome. So even under the best of circumstances, I think the relationship would have been a tense and perhaps hostile one. Cuba ultimately became a real focal point in the Cold War because it turned to the Soviet Union for assistance.
Cuba's assigned share of the United States sugar market has been cut by 95%.
By the end of 1959, it seemed to the Eisenhower administration that there was no turning back. In addition to cutting sugar imports, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency was authorized to conduct a campaign of sabotage that would include burning sugarcane fields and a number of bombings. And as the CIA had done before and would do again, it planned a covert operation that the president could deny.
The French munition ship La Coubre blazes at dockside in Havana after
The CIA had hoped that violence would cause panic, weakening the Castro regime. But despite the destruction and occasional loss of life, Cubans rallied behind their government.
Eisenhower felt that that was inadequate, that there needed to be, the thing needed to be thought through, and there needed to be some kind of a comprehensive plan.
A more comprehensive plan was quickly put together by Allen Dulles, director of the CIA. He delivered it to Eisenhower on the 17th of March. The CIA would begin training large numbers of Cuban exiles for guerrilla warfare inside Cuba. The CIA began recruiting disaffected young Cubans, targeting the neighborhood known as Little Havana in Miami, and also anti-Castro student groups in Havana. From Miami, the recruits were flown in unmarked planes to a training camp in the mountains of Guatemala.
The training included what we needed to know about radio communications, about hiding, about moving from safe house to safe house, about demolition, about intelligence gathering, about organizing and directing guerrilla groups, both in urban and rural areas.
The CIA had located the training base in Guatemala as part of its effort to hide the U.S. role in the operation. This was something Eisenhower had insisted on from the beginning.
Your candidates for the most important office in the free world seek...
In the fall of 1960, Vice President Richard Nixon and Senator John F. Kennedy were locked in a heated campaign for president. Unaware of what the CIA was planning, Kennedy attacked the Eisenhower administration for doing too little about Cuba. While the candidates argued, the CIA escalated its plans once again. Instead of training exiles for guerrilla warfare, they were now planning an amphibious assault on the Cuban mainland. Eisenhower also wanted the invasion linked to a popular uprising against the government. The Cuban exiles in Guatemala had no doubt it would happen. That has only recently been declassified. In it, they predicted that an invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles would trigger a popular uprising against the government.
Some analysts in the government knew that Fidel Castro's regime was quite widely popular on the island. But the people who were organizing the operation and dealing primarily with Cuban exiles had convinced themselves that Castro was widely hated and the population would rise up against him in the event of this invasion.
The opposition to Castro was in Miami. These are guys that had left. There were a lot of people who had risen up against Castro, yep, but they were no longer there.
The invaders had to hold a small piece of territory for a couple of days. Then the United States would recognize them as the new provisional democratic government of Cuba. This new government of Cuba would immediately call upon the President of the United States to give them military support. The President would authorize the military support. I would assume naval, air, and land forces, and you would have a U.S. invasion of Cuba.
Castro marks the second anniversary of his revolution with the biggest military parade ever staged in Cuba. Shortly afterwards, Castro demanded the United States Embassy drastically reduce its staff to 11 persons. President Eisenhower broke off diplomatic relations with a message read by Press Secretary Haggerty.
There is a limit to what the United States in self-respect can endure. That limit has now been reached.
En route to their new address, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
By the time John F. Kennedy was sworn in as President of the United States on January 20th, the CIA plan to invade Cuba was nearly complete. But the idea was viewed skeptically by the State Department. In a memo to the President, State Department officials argued that no popular uprising against Fidel Castro was likely, and that the U.S. role in the invasion was bound to become apparent, damaging the United States' reputation worldwide. While Kennedy shared these concerns, he seemed unwilling to call it off.
Kennedy felt politically compelled to do something, to act, again, for political reasons. He did not want to be seen as weak or soft on Castro's communism, weak on the Castro threat.
Combine the Kennedy's inexperience, the send-off from Eisenhower, the persuasive powers of Bissell, the fact that a lot had already been done, the thing was rolling. You know what happens when something has achieved momentum. Calling things off usually goes against the grain.
In March of 1961, Bissell and his team presented Kennedy with a detailed plan for the invasion of Cuba. They recommended a daytime landing at Trinidad, a Cuban coastal town of 18,000 people, where there was reported to be anti-Castro sentiment. If things went wrong, the brigade could retreat to the Escambray Mountains just a few miles away. But after hearing the plan, Kennedy rejected it. In his words, it was far too noisy.
This was a blatant invasion where the American hand was very evident. He preferred to see all of this done covertly, quietly. Let's try to keep the American profile low.
Bissell and his team came up with a revised plan for a nighttime landing at an isolated spot called the Bay of Pigs. But there were risks. There were only 2 roads to and from the beach, and they were surrounded by impenetrable swamps. This would make it hard for Castro to reach them, but equally hard for the brigade to fight its way out. Coral reefs offshore would make a nighttime landing dangerous. Once the beach was secured, the invasion force of 1,200 men would move inland to secure a nearby airfield in the small town of Palpite. They would continue down the road to the Australian sugar mill and the highway that runs the length of Cuba. From there, they would move towards either end of the island, gathering support as they went. The invasion would be preceded by a series of bombing attacks that would destroy the Cuban Air Force. Then, when Castro's forces moved to counterattack, they would be hit by the CIA bombers. In describing this plan to the president, however, Bissell neglected to tell Kennedy that the Escambray Mountains were 80 miles away from the new landing site, making an escape there no longer possible. He also made no mention of the CIA's assumption that under certain circumstances, the U.S. military would be called on for assistance. Despite his lingering reservations, Kennedy agreed. The operation could go forward.
This is about the last thing in the world a new president would want. That's what he felt, I think, but couldn't force himself to simply tell the CIA and the Pentagon, look, you've organized it, now disorganize it.
On April 4th, Kennedy and his top advisors met to review the plan one last time. Kennedy had invited an old friend, Senator William Fulbright. Fulbright had found out about the plans for invading Cuba and had given Kennedy a memo attacking it. The memo was drafted by Fulbright's chief foreign policy assistant, Pat Holt.
It was illegal under U.S. law, under international law, and we would be stuck with what amounted to a civil war in Cuba. And even if our side won the Civil War, we would be stuck with rebuilding Cuba.
Despite what Fulbright had said, one by one, Kennedy's advisors voted to go ahead with the invasion.
The momentum of events was such, and the entrapment, political entrapment, as a result of inheriting this from Eisenhower, was so great that he couldn't call it off.
Presumably, evidently, said to himself, all things considered, what the hell, let's do it. It was just that stupidly simple.
Then on the morning of April 7th, the New York Times ran a front-page story by Tad Schultz. It described the planned invasion of Cuba in detail. Through sources in Washington and Miami, Schultz had learned nearly everything. After reading the article, Kennedy tossed the paper to the floor. "What's the use of planning a covert operation," he muttered, "when Castro can read about it in the New York Times?"
What is important about this is not so much what I knew or the New York Times knew, but if we did, every Cuban Castro agent in Miami had to know it too.
Despite the fact that the details of the operation were widely known, both in the U.S. and Cuba, neither the CIA nor the White House ever seriously considered calling it off.
These are men who are supremely confident that they could manage things. If something went wrong one day, well, they could recoup and figure out another way to bring it to fruition.
On April 12th, Kennedy held a press conference.
Well, first I want to say that there will not be, under any conditions, be an intervention in Cuba by United States Armed Forces.
For the Cuban exiles in Guatemala and the CIA planners in Washington, the question was, did he mean it?
Fidel Castro whips up a furor in Cuba, charging the United States with arming and training mercenary forces for an...
Despite Kennedy's denials, the Cubans knew an invasion was coming, and they had begun to prepare.
Ya teníamos información de lo que pasaba.
We already had information about what was going on, and we were creating files on the people who were conspiring.
As the Cubans prepared for invasion, the CIA readied a fleet of 16 B-26 bombers on an airfield in Nicaragua. The planes had been bought and refurbished by the CIA, but would be flown by Cuban exiles. The first wave of bombers took off on April 15th, 2 days before the invasion was scheduled to begin. By late morning, bombs had fallen on 3 Cuban airfields.
Cuando se produjo el bombardeo a 3 instalaciones cubanas, 2 bases aéreas.
When bombing started at the 3 Cuban installations, 2 air bases and a civilian airport, it became obvious that this was the beginning of an invasion. Fidel ordered the complete mobilization of the armed forces to await the invasion.
The Castro repressive forces arrested tens of thousands of people, locked them up before the invasion, so that the CIA knew at the time of the invasion that there would be no uprising on the island.
Following the airstrike on the 15th, 2 of the CIA's bombers landed in Florida. The pilots claimed to be defectors from the Cuban Air Force, making it appear that the bombings had been carried out by Cubans against their own government. Cuba's ambassador to the United Nations accused the United States of bombing Cuba. U.S. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson made a passionate response.
These charges are totally false, and I deny them categorically. The United States has committed no aggression against Cuba, and no offensive has been launched from Florida or from any other part of the United States.
Stevenson was unaware at the time of the extent to which the CIA was involved, but it quickly became apparent when reporters in Miami revealed the defection story was a hoax.
The plane, which had been painted as Cuban Air Force, this was supposedly a defecting pilot who had done the bombing, that the paint was very fresh.
Stevenson was furious and called Kennedy. It was Stevenson's anger at being deceived, and as he saw it, made a fool of in the eyes of the world, that led Kennedy to scrub the second airstrike. Bissell went to see Dean Rusk to plead with him. Rusk called President Kennedy. Kennedy said no, he wasn't going to change his mind, and Rusk offered the phone to Bissell. You talk to him, you convince him, and Bissell said no.
The first airstrike had destroyed a number of Cuban planes. Castro hurried to the scene, assuming that more airstrikes would follow.
Bissell accepted the cancellation of the second airstrike and allowed the invasion to go forward. He thought, once the brigade was on the beach, that Kennedy would be forced to change his mind and use U.S. troops.
It was old, beat-up cargo banana boats. We didn't know at what time we were supposed to land or arrive or anything. The only thing we knew is that we were on our way.
The brigade would be commanded by a young former sergeant in the Cuban Army, Pepe San Roman. But behind the scenes, the operation would be controlled by 2 American CIA officers stationed on a command ship named the Blagar. One of the officers, Grayston Lynch, would go ashore with a team of Cuban frogmen to place landing lights on the beach. On the way, there was an unexpected mishap.
One of our lights that we used to mark the beach flared up until we could cover it up. Well, the militia saw it, so they came with a Jeep and turned their headlights on us. We had to smoke them up. That started the whole thing.
The brigade began coming ashore in small boats powered by outboard motors.
Well, those boats were so full, and you would just, don't move, otherwise water will get in.
The night was very dark, there was no moon, it was very confusing. As we got closer to shore, they started firing tracer bullets from shore. You know, at that point, I think we really mentally went into battle.
At 3 a.m., Fidel Castro was awakened in Havana and told that the enemy had landed at Playa Giron. Castro immediately dispatched troops under the command of Jose Ramon Fernandez, now the vice president of Cuba. Castro ordered Fernandez to seize the town of Palpite. He knew that if his troops held there, the invaders would be trapped.
And that's why Fidel, when I told him we took Palpite, he said, "We've already won the war."
Castro was also on the phone to his pilots.
He told me to leave as soon as possible to be over Playa Giron at daybreak and surprise the landing there, and to attack the boats transporting the troops.
I got a radio message to report back out to the ship immediately. When I got out there, I got the message that said that you're going to get hit at daylight by Castro plane.
I flew over the first boat that I saw that was a little separated from the other ones, and later I learned that it was the Houston. I launched 8 rockets, and the impact of one of them started the boat leaking petroleum.
Finally, they allowed our planes to come up 2 at a time to the bay. And 2 at a time, they were shot down. lost 8 planes that day. We never could get all of the ammunition ashore. They attacked us all day long.
By mid-afternoon on the first day of fighting, Fidel Castro arrived to take personal command of his forces.
La que llegó nuestro comandante jefe.
That night they came in with tanks, and it was a tremendous tank battle.
They assumed that how could any president bear to suffer this kind of humiliation? He would have to send in troops and air support, at least naval support. I mean, American ships were waiting out there. The planes were on alert.
The CIA and the White House were closely monitoring the deteriorating situation in Cuba. On the evening of Tuesday, April 18th, following a formal reception at the White House, Kennedy called a meeting of his advisors to consider what ought to be done.
I think what the CIA had in mind was once the thing started, that if it began to fail, that the United States, having gone that far, would have no choice but to commit U.S. troops and send in the Marines. But Kennedy had made clear that he would not do that. They thought that the force of events would compel him to do that, but he stuck to what he originally said.
This would have been a very complicated landing from sea, facing troops that were highly motivated, as it turned out, and people who believed they were defending their homeland, it would have been a bloody battle.
We captured dozens of men, some hidden in houses, some crouched in corners. No one fired a single shot. I can assure you we captured practically everyone.
Later on that day, they moved a group of us outside to the beach, and they lined us up there like a firing squad. And we all thought that we were going to be shot, gone. And we just look at each other like saying goodbye and stand still and be brave, and that's it. And all of a sudden, we were surrounded by photographers and journalists from all over, and we were being displayed.
Then they told us that the order was that we were not to be shot. After a day and a half or so, put on a bus to Havana.
Nearly 1,200 were captured. The prisoners were eventually subjected to a mass trial and convicted of crimes against the state. They would be sentenced to 30 years in prison. By the time it was over, 185 members of the brigade were either killed or listed as missing in action, and there were dead on the other side as well. In the aftermath, Kennedy struggled for an answer. How had things gone so wrong? The United States had suffered a humiliating defeat in the first months of his presidency.
He was agitated in a way that I had never seen him before, extremely upset. And what he said more than once was, how could I have been so stupid to rely upon these advisors?
He said, we've had a big kick in the ass and we deserved it, that we're going to learn some things from it. And one of the things he said he would learn was that he would never again be overawed by advice from the Joint Chiefs of Staff or from the CIA.
4 days after the invasion of Cuba had begun, Kennedy held a press conference to make a statement about its failure. He took personal responsibility for the defeat.
There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. And
Fidel Castro further humiliated Kennedy and the United States by publicly displaying the brigade prisoners before the world's press. Kennedy asked his brother Robert, said to be the second most powerful man in Washington, to head up a new effort to eliminate the Cuban leader. It would be codenamed Operation Mongoose.
We were going to have to come up with a plan to get rid of Castro and the Castro regime. When I asked Bissell what were the limits on the phrase get rid of, he said as far as he knew, none. Get rid of.
Get rid of would include numerous attempts to assassinate the Cuban leader.
There was the poison wetsuit caper because they knew Castro liked diving. There was a poisoned cigar. There was the plot to kill him with a sniper rifle.
The CIA were not the only ones trying to kill Fidel Castro. An anti-Castro terrorist group called Alpha 66 had formed under the leadership of this man, Eloy Gutierrez Manoya, who was later captured and spent 22 years in a Cuban prison. None of the assassination attempts were successful. But Castro assumed that the Americans were unlikely to stop there, and he was right. Operation Mongoose also included plans for another invasion of Cuba.
Castro was convinced that if there was going to be the next time would not be Cubans from Miami, there would be Americans from United States Armed Forces.
The Cubans were desperate to find some way to get the Soviet Union to guarantee their survival and their independence.